New Guinea in the 1950s. A deadly epidemic is killing tens of thousands of women and children. No one understands why. A young American physician, Dr. D. Carleton Gajdusek, decides to solve the mystery. He turns out to be one of the century's true geniuses, a man prepared to defy convention and challenge people's most cherished beliefs. In time, his research will lead to a revolutionary discovery and the world's highest scientific honors. His time in the South Seas wouldn't only affect his career. Over the following years, he would adopt 57 kids and give them a new life in America. Carleton Gajdusek would perhaps break too many boundaries. As his scientific career was reaching its height, rumors began to spread that he was a pedophile. Legendary scientists around the world leapt to his defense.
I think that Carleton is a work of art, a unified work of art. And there are very few of those.
I don't know what's more impressive, the memory or the diversity of interest or the total energy level. But this is one unique character. There's no way you couldn't become fascinated by this guy.
There's an astonishing directness of action, of thought, of emotion. He, for better or worse, he does not have the indirections, some of the prevarications and the inhibitions which the rest of us have.
I think Carleton would never have gone into the areas of thought where he solved the Kuru problem, let's say, and beyond that, the Creutzfeldt-Jakob problem as it relates to mad cow and things like this, and the protein research he's done, if it weren't for the ability to let go and go beyond the accepted.
Every day of my life, usually in the morning, I would get up, take out my cyanide bottle, and say, should I stay around today or not? And I would contemplate suicide thoroughly. I would say, probably not today, we'll think about it tomorrow. And I did that every day of my life, including yesterday, today, and about 4 or 5 times.
Was born into an immigrant family from Central Europe in New York in 1923. His mother came from the wealthy middle class. Her dream was to be a poet in Greenwich Village. She fed her children myths of antique gods and heroes. Gajdusek's father flirted with every woman he met and ran a successful slaughterhouse business.
If I were asked, I'd say, what was Carleton's first word? I'd say no. It was no. In other words, Carleton, we want you to do this. No, I will not. Carleton, it's time to eat dinner. No. He had a will that was of iron. And that will was one where he was expressing what he needed in order to be himself or to follow his values. Now, my mother so loved him that she couldn't place her will dominant above his. She'd finally give in to him. And I think out of that struggle that was going on was coming his talent and his vision.
Young Carleton quickly realized that he was different from his family and surroundings. He was an exception, a freak, more intelligent and willful than anyone he knew.
In some way in early childhood, I gave up the desire to ever be like a peer. And it wasn't until adolescence I realized that most of my peers wanted to be like each other. I don't remember any time in my entire life I ever wanted to be like anybody.
In his youth, Carleton maintained a distance from his parents, instead attaching himself to his eccentric aunt, Irene Dubrovsky, one of the first female entomologists in the US. Irene began to reveal to him the mysteries of science, opening up a whole new world.
She said, everything you see in the sky, I was 2 or 3, belongs to us. And she showed me the shapely picture of our donut galaxy. She says, we're a couple of billion dots and we're just an insignificant one, a couple of billion. That's like your position among humanity on Earth. You're one of a couple of billion. And Irene would say, look, Carleton, they are as small compared to you and me as you and I are compared to the solar system. They go something like, for us, going around the world 10 times to find the one of their mate, and then they track it down over a billion-fold times their length, and then they have to get 9 positions to mate. The space age to come has a machine that is even 1,000% as complicated. So I realized everything in the world was a fraud. And this is life. She said, are you any more important than they? And of course, they had unbelievable respect for life, but not human. We're just one bit of it. But that was long before I learned to read and write.
By the time he was 4, Carleton started to help his aunt collect beetles and poisonous spiders. Irene equipped him with a large jar of deadly cyanide in which to drop his captives.
Carleton was then wearing thick lenses, and he tended to hold his head a little on the side. And therefore, I remember kids cruelly calling him Four Eyes and things like this, and sort of taunting him with his heavy books in his hand and studying all the time and everything.
In response, Carleton threatened to poison the whole class, understandably stopping the bullying. The teachers were perturbed, but the headmaster judged the boy mature enough to keep his jar of cyanide.
Carleton was aloof. Carleton did flee, I think, to a certain extent into his scientific methodologies in order to escape into a purity that he needed in some ways.
In his loneliness, Carleton made ambitious plans for his education. At 11, he decided to devote his life to exploring science. At 14, he began to keep a journal, a life's work that in time would fill 1 million pages.
I saw him as someone who was very quickly entering into the adult world. He was in his earlier teens when he went off to Rochester, and that was the first leaving of the family, and I think he must have felt lonely, terribly apart, terribly alienated. I think it hurt him. I think really.
But Gajdusek felt alienated not only from his peers and family, but from all of American society. Perhaps his most important issue was sexuality.
I already had strange fears about myself being non-human. One was the fact that by the slightest masturbatory allusion to the feminine form, I turned off my erotic interest. So I did have, therefore, a long prepubertal wonder why all the people I was around were so hep on heterosexuality when I had not even the slightest curiosity about it, and it in no way repelled me. It just was no more interested than a dragonfly or a rock.
It must have been a relief when his aunt started taking him on trips to Indian reservations. Here he experienced an entirely different culture, with a tolerance for homosexuality. A people uninfluenced by Christian civilization, where he could break the confines of American morality.
I was interested in people who hadn't been brainwashed, and I decided that I needed to know cultures that had nothing to do with the concept of monotheism.
The trip sowed a seed. From now on, Gajdusek would long for distant cultures, untouched by the great religions and civilizations of the earth. As a teen, Carleton raced through the education system. At 22 years old, he became the youngest medical student ever to graduate from Harvard Medical School.
Only for a male figure. My father died when I was 3 years old. I didn't know very much of him. And there he was, just by good luck. My father figure, my mentor, the most important person in my life.
Another kid that Gajdusek mentored was a next-door neighbor.
My father came from a very working-class family. Education and a future was never really encouraged and talked about in the family. And so my father, who had a natural inquisitive nature, established his own little museum as a kid, and he'd collect things in the neighborhood and at the park, and he would exhibit them and charge the neighborhood children a nickel. And that's when he first met Carleton. Carleton walked in to his museum, paid the money, and that's how he established a relationship. And my father described himself as a bit of a street punk and a kid who was getting into trouble, and he was able to sort of make his path and find his career through Carleton's mentorship.
He was driven to, probably by his own sense of inadequacies and losses in his own life and deprivations. He was led to a sensitivity towards those of other children that was extraordinary. In other words, he must have suffered a kind of childhood isolation, loneliness that could only be answered by his immediate response for someone else who was suffering that, another child.
Whilst completing his medical studies, Gajdusek also joined the most exclusive and forward-looking research environment of the time, Caltech, California. By night, he read quantum mechanics and biology. During the day, he led wild mountain treks. The trekkers included James Watson, who would unlock the secrets of DNA, Linus Pauling, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and Benoît Mandelbrot, who would elucidate the theory of fractals. Gajdusek studied single-mindedly to help solve some of the intractable mysteries of medicine. What most fascinated him were fatal diseases and children.
I have lived at Boston Children's Hospital from my second day at Harvard Medical School. It's 9 years with no other house, no apartment, right in the hospital. I have never in my life taken care of diseases you can cure. And I've been interested in it. I picked rabies, acute encephalitis, Kuru, multiple sclerosis, 100% fatal, sarcomas, which we never cure in a kid today. The minute we know those treatments, you can give those to an illiterate New Guinean. You don't have to go to Harvard Medical School and learn mathematics.
Carleton, in a certain sense, could have become anything, or nothing at all, as a matter of fact. The nurses were scared of him. He was not doing the jobs the way they were supposed to be done. He was not writing clean reports. In fact, they were happy to let him go.
Gajdusek was nicknamed Atom Bomb Gajdusek. He hardly ever slept and seemed to know no boundaries. In his journal, he wrote that his colleagues saw him as a meteor, doomed to burn itself out before it strikes the earth.
All of his life, he's done exactly what he wanted to do. If Carleton had been a criminal, the world would be a terrible place. You know, I mean, we're just fortunate that people like Carleton really do sort of belong to the class of the good and not the class of the evil, because Carleton as a sociopath would have been a world disaster.
In 1948, the UN sent Gajdusek on a mission to Germany Carleton grew close to a German family and offered to take their son to the US to be educated and see the world. He persuaded his mother to adopt the boy. It was to be the start of a life devoted to adopted kids.
It was a surprise, I mean, for me to be selected by Carleton, that to come over to the States to have an opportunity, you know. And I trusted him implicitly. He would take care of me. I don't know why he ever brought me to the States. I'm so glad that he did, but I don't know why he did it. I may have been the beginning of a great experiment. This was his world. And he was taking me into his world.
Carleton is at this time worried about what mother thinks about his sexual orientation. And he realizes that this is a great problem. The unfulfillment of it and the desire for it is an enormous problem.
When she began recognizing that I was not going to play the game of marriage of convenience and things of this sort, those became obsessions with her. And I would just fling them aside as absolutely ridiculous, you see. And this hurt her very much.
During the Korean War, Gajdusek was conscripted into the Army's Research Institute. Here was a chance to travel around the world at the Army's expense, searching for the deadliest illnesses. He researched hemorrhagic fever among the troops in Korea, traveled back and forth between Sweden and Siberia, Afghanistan and Malaysia. In South America, he studied jungle fever. In Iran, rabies.
Carleton was bound to do something interesting, but he might have gotten a terrible, horrible unpleasantness, died because of being too daring. What he was doing were very, very risky.
In the 1950s, there were still pockets of civilization which had been isolated from the rest of the world for centuries. Gajdusek concluded that those islands of original man could be laboratories of huge scientific value, not only for extreme diseases, but also culture and behavior. But it wasn't just science that attracted him.
He writes in his letters to his mother that he realizes he has a great affinity and rapport with black people, black primitives, he says. And he's enthralled. He developed a very close relationship with the children in particular. He's found what he wants to do in life, and that is to hang out with primitives.
On his travels, Gajdusek discovered what he considered his life's most important task: a study of human development from infant to adult in the world's most isolated societies. Whilst the modern world was entranced by the idea of flying to the moon, Gajdusek was travelling back to the Stone Age.
I thought his ability to retroject himself into the past, into a culture sort of utterly unlike anything now, was quite amazing. It was not just a wish to understand diseases, but I think the ability to enter and understand other people's lives and the lives of cultures which are so different, which I think goes amazingly with this beautiful, powerful scientific mind. Not too common, I think, to see that combination.
Gajdusek was often the first outsider these communities had ever seen. The camera he used, the first piece of metal they'd encountered. By living with them and taking samples of blood, skin and sperm, he explored both what diseases affected the tribes and how the people lived and loved. He hoped his studies would answer bigger questions. How the art of drawing is born and developed, how language and culture are transformed, He wrote to his mother that he found nothing more terrifying than respectability and realism.
Was he a physician? But in that case, why was he doing all these crazy things? And he, in a certain sense, making some things look easy, which are very difficult. Easy actually for him because he was not bound by rules of a certain profession, a certain game. And that is something very, very profound. People don't like competition from outsiders. And he was an outsider everywhere.
In the middle of the 50s, Gajdusek heard the news that would make his career. A deadly epidemic had broken out among New Guinea's cannibalistic Fore tribe. Women and children were dying in tens of thousands from a new and very painful sickness. He set off to investigate.
First of all, I mean, Kuru is an extraordinary disease. It's a mysterious, bizarre, fatal brain disease. He'd heard they were cannibals, he knew that sorcery was practiced, which he loved. He thought, how wonderfully exotic and primitive. And Carleton thought, this is my territory, this is my people.
I happen to have been in hospitals like the Boston Children's and Columbia Presbyterian Babies Hospital. And during that period, I knew of nothing but seeing children die 1, 2, 3, or 4 a day. And so when I first saw those kids, it took me about 35 minutes to say, this is an organic disease, and no one on earth has seen it before. Because in my competent 31 years, I knew the most about this sort of thing on earth.
This Kuru now you're speaking.
That's right. And therefore, I looked at these kids and I said, Jesus Christ. No goddamn bastard on earth has ever seen a disease like this. That's why my first letter says, this is something, Joe. It'll change the world.
Everything was perfect. He was the right person in the right place, the right time. It's just, he was extraordinarily fortunate that that should have happened to him.
Although he had no permission, resources or equipment, Carleton cancelled his return flight to the US. He set up a small lab in the jungle and started to dissect the victims of the disease on his kitchen table.
Now, I'd heard lots of stories about Carleton. Those stories were pretty weird, and they depended largely on the attitude of the speaker more than anything else. You know. But just before I went up there, the director of public health said, well, you know what your primary duties are. Your main function there is to stop Gajdusek. Anyway, you know, it was clear from the moment he stepped in the house and we started talking that we were getting on. And in the first couple of days, you know, while we were talking, we sort of planned out these experiments that I've spent the rest of my life working on. But
he would take blood and urine swabs and tissues. The other thing, of course, that Carleton desperately wanted were the brains of the Kuru dead. Now, a lot of this was very difficult, of course, because the Fore feared sorcery, and sorcerers worked through taking a part of the body and casting spells on that. So Carleton obviously had to use all his power of persuasion to get these specimens. It was very, very difficult, I think.
The Fore people were unusual cannibals. As part of their burial rituals, to prevent body parts being stolen for use in black magic practices, dead relatives were cooked and eaten.
It was Carleton asking for the bodies of the Kuru dead and initially dissecting them on what was his dining table. So I remember asking an old fellow, didn't you think Carleton might have been a cannibal? This fellow looked at me rather quizzically and said, no, not at all. I mean, why would he eat these people? He hardly knew them.
Now, come on.
This is the biggest epidemic on Earth that's ever occurred of degenerative brain disease. It has no inflammation in the spinal fluid. There's no protein. We've just done the taps. And we did spinal fluids within a few hours, and they have no cells. This is unique on Earth. And nobody even trying to find out what's causing it.
No one except Gajdusek, who realized the importance of the mystery. Although the disease was highly contagious, it showed none of the usual signs of infection. Yet as it progressed, the patient's brain became a sponge, the nervous system and muscle function degenerating in a few months. The outcome was death. Gajdusek started making dangerous forays into the homeland of the Fore people and their unknown tribal neighbors, ostensibly to see the extent of the epidemic, but also to advance his anthropological studies.
The Kimi people border the Fore on the west. The Kimi anoint their body and hair with pig grease, as do all of the natives of the region. In some of the hamlets of the region, grease from human relatives is still occasionally used, although cannibalism has now been abandoned by most of the communities. Here, the Kuru Epidemiological Patrol is making a medical inspection for yaws and tropical ulcers. Fortunately, we are able to cure yaws with penicillin therapy in a very dramatic fashion, and this has helped our entry throughout the region.
Returned from these expeditions, Gajdusek and his collaborators immediately performed autopsies on every Kuru victim they could find. In the heart of the jungle, they froze the brains and managed, despite the obstacles, to dispatch them across the world to Bethesda, Maryland. In the US, the hard work began, trying to find out what the disease actually was.
It was quite clear to everybody that this should be an infectious disease, but it wasn't going anywhere. Everything that they were studying turned out not to be the answer. What provoked disappointment was that no matter what we inoculated, whether it was eggs or tissue cultures or small animals or even larger animals, we could never get the disease to transmit.
What puzzled Gajdusek's team was that all known disease bearers have a genetic component. With the best laboratories in the world analyzing the Fore people's brains, no hint of genetic material could be found. But Gajdusek suspected that an unknown and revolutionary disease bearer lurked in the brain substance. He postulated something that could reproduce and spread without DNA, unlike any living organism. His theory contradicted all accepted knowledge and met strong opposition. But Gajdusek was adamant.
My attitude is, if you ever write anything in your life where you have to publish it today and not in the next 5 years or 10, burn it. If anybody on earth is ever going to do it in your lifetime, and you write it, and you have to publish it before to get credit for it, burn it. I'm not interested in your brain and your credit. I'm only interested in when you do something that nobody else is going to do. I don't give shit about all the other scientists on earth. I'm considering me and the problem.
Gajdusek had spotted similarities between Kuru and the better-known afflictions Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. To prove himself right, Carleton set up a secret laboratory for animal experimentation. He injected the animals with material from the victims, hoping the disease would spread. But as time passed, nothing seemed to happen.
A normal person would have given up after a year. I would have gone to New Guinea, you would have gone to New Guinea, said, yeah, that's a hell of a disease. It's killing all these people. But, you know, what possible significance could it have for the world at large and my career as an important scientist? Zero. Well, that didn't happen. Carleton never gave up. He never gave up trying to figure out this disease. And he made it happen by sheer perseverance.
In all his efforts, Gajdusek was supported by the local communities. In his journal, he speaks gratefully of his helpers. They work wonderfully for me, though I cannot adequately repay them. How much I would like to have them in the US and share my home with them. In 1963, he decided to adopt an 11-year-old who'd worked as his porter. Over the following years, kids from around the globe joined Gajdusek in his expanding home in Washington.
It was somewhere in the 80s when I was doing 5th grade that I heard Carleton had come to the village. I ran to Ketabi from my school. He recognized me, and also my father guided me to him. And that's where he whispered to me if I wanted to go to America with him in Pidgin. He took me to Plaigolo, America. I thought, yeah.
Once I asked Carleton how he chose or selected the people to come, and he always said, well, it was the ones who knew there was more to life than the island, who saw an airplane and would say, gee, it's not just us here, there's something else out there, who could look out on the horizon and see other things.
Explaining his urge to foster the children, Gajdusek writes, I cannot leave the kids in the ignorance and superstition of their homelands. To do so would be an insult to their intelligence.
I never experienced a father so many years that he looked after me. And I never thought of somebody like that. He's an outsider, took me in as his own and put me through education. I never think I'll experience the life I did. I call him a dad or mom. You're not like a father. You're just, you both things at one time.
Carleton would often come with his entourage, which included many of his adopted sons, who were great kids. They liked to do sports, all the stuff that my brother and I would enjoy doing, running around, playing basketball, and actually we looked forward to having them around because we would have a lot of fun when they came.
There's certain moments when I've seen Carleton at Thanksgiving sitting downstairs in the Yonkers house in his big chair with all of the kids on the floor around him and watching TV or listening to music. And he's like Father Abraham with all
After supports. In these terms, he has a very large family, 40, 50, 60 boys. I don't know how many. Once you get past 10 or 12, it doesn't much make any difference.
They were adopted according to the laws and practices in the countries that they came from. And as Carleton argues quite forcefully, and as an anthropologist, I believe him about this, children are shared much more freely in most of the places that these kids came from. So they were being shared with him.
Carleton has never professed that bloodlines mean very much to him at all. And therefore he proves this by taking people of the world and loving them as much as a person can be loved, and making no distinctions between family rights in love and anyone's right to love.
After years of no results in the lab, one of the chimpanzees at Gajdusek's research station started to display the first symptoms of Kuru. As the chimpanzee trembled and twitched, Gajdusek's theory was finally confirmed. He'd found a new kind of disease, which contained no DNA and yet could reproduce and spread. Today, these particles are called prions.
The key, as it turns out, to the transmission of Kuru, and it's quite interesting, wasn't so much a matter of species. We could have just as easily done it in a squirrel monkey, or as it turns out, maybe even a mouse. The key was holding the animal under observation for a year instead of months or weeks.
Gajdusek's team had proven that Kuru was caused by a deadly invisible particle. But how had it been transmitted? Where had the disease originated?
It was only with the successful transmission that cannibalism became a candidate route, because cannibalism was a relatively recent practice among foray, and Kuru had arisen not all that long after cannibalism had begun.
But Carleton wouldn't allow cannibalism as the answer, because we had this exotic disease, we had this transmission with a long incubation period, everything was bizarre, and then we wanted to say where it was transmitted was through cannibalism, and no, that was too much. But then the epidemiology, that was a striking, changing pattern, because the highest concentration of the agent was definitely in the brain. And it was so, therefore, those who ate the brain were the ones who really had the high exposure, and that involved the women and children. So when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it just fitted, it just made sense.
The discovery was revolutionary. Prions would emerge as the cause of mad cow disease and be linked to other unexplained diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Awareness of Gajdusek's achievements began to spread. He was showered with prizes and
you manage financially?
Well, by handing down clothing from one generation to the next, and by making great use of our friends. Now in our tour through Europe, I am accepting the many proffered invitations for lectureships and the like from friends and visits to colleagues, with a footnote that week 10 will be coming.
So you have no difficulties knowing what to do with the Nobel money?
Oh, no. The boys have calculated that for 2.5 years they might be able to have less complaints about financial problems, and after that they wonder what I'm going to do.
It seems like fatherly beneficence, but for years quiet rumors had circulated about Gajdusek's unconventional family. Then, in 1996, one of his foster sons accused Carleton of having had oral sex with him.
What is true, sir? I don't even quite understand what the charges are all about, so I'll have to talk about that later.
Go around. I was horrified when he was arrested. It was one of the biggest shocks of my life.
No, this thing, I didn't believe it. I didn't. I was shocked and I was mad at the same time. Because all my life living with him, I never see such thing.
Here's a man greatly honored by the world who is suddenly being disgraced and humiliated.
I was with him when he was arrested, and it was a very unpleasant scene, and everything after that for the next year and a half was very unpleasant.
No, as a matter of fact, we discussed his suicide, and we discussed it that him doing here wouldn't be a bad place. And if he needed assistance, I would assist him.
They say that in a telephone conversation you admitted that you're a pedophile?
As was Jesus Christ, Andre Gide, and Sister Teresa. Anyone who isn't married and loves a young person might call that an identifier. During his troubles when he was arrested, there was the press wanting me to say something with all the microphones pressed up against me. And I said what spontaneously came out of my mind. He's closer to a saint than anyone I've ever known. He's a pure saint. You people are crazy, is what I was saying. They never bothered to talk to me again after that.
Carleton's scientific friends jumped to his defense, writing to the judge to stress his academic importance. They seemed not to have questioned whether his genius was relevant to the charges.
My second-in-command pulled me into her office and told me that you're not going to like what the suspect in the case does. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, he's a Nobel Prize winning scientist. And of course, at that moment, I knew that this case would be different than most of the run-of-the-mill child abuse cases that we dealt with. Well, we immediately realized just how many people were supporting Dr. Gajdusek.
We come across oceans and continents to be here, to be with Dr. Gajdusek, because we support him, and we believe in his goodness as a human being.
You see, if he was a lousy scientist and not winning any prizes, and that wouldn't have happened. No one would know about it. It wouldn't be front page news. It wouldn't be on television with his hands cuffed, this older man with a belly sticking out being pushed around, with people treating him with disdain. But this was made into a modest cause celeb. So I think, I don't want to make nothing of it, but clearly it didn't demand the problems, the magnitude of the problems he got.
Well, it was eye-opening for me because I didn't realize just how revered Nobel Prize winners are in the scientific community. I mean, he's, for lack of a better term, a rock star, and there were people that just didn't want to see anything negative come towards him.
There we are. These are records or papers, statement of support for Dr. Carleton Gajdusek by citizens of Papua New Guinea. These were undoubtedly during the trial, and they were letters from the whole community back there in the islands. I know that there are boxes of just letters of support from scientists throughout the world, and those are wonderful to see. And they were all sent, copied and sent to the judge. I don't know how much he read.
I think most of the scientific community was with him because they knew him. He had been everywhere. Of course, he had spoken everywhere, and people could see the greatness and could see that he's the kind of person that the petty forces of law and order could easily try to destroy.
I knew no details of the charges, nor did I bother to read any. I gathered that in New Guinea, some form of sexual contact between adults and adolescent youths was almost part of the culture. I knew that Carleton had been adored by his sons. I doubted if anyone had been hurt or damaged.
Hundreds of letters came in to the judge saying, hey, wait a minute, this is just routine for us. We do this all the time. What's the big deal?
Of course, this defense of Gajdusek assumes that if sex with children is condoned in the South Seas, then sex with children adopted from that culture is untroubling. During Carleton's earliest expeditions, the first premise had been proven. He had made contact with the feared kuku-kuku. who believed that sperm had magic power and that ritually consuming it turned boys into men.
The kuka were notorious in colonial New Guinea as particularly fierce and untrustworthy and wild. So Carleton loved them. He was utterly enthralled by them. He admired especially their penchant for trade and for fellatio.
So there were stories about Carleton, that he was homosexual and that these cookers were terrible homosexual people, and that's why he loved going over there, and all these incredible practices that were literally unspeakable. You couldn't talk about them, probably because nobody knew about them, but still, they were those things that you didn't talk about. And he was into it, he loved it, and he loved these people, and so he was someone not to be trusted.
In his journals, Gajdusek describes his first contact with the kuku. 6th October 1957, camp number 6. Today we descended east-west toward the river, dropped over 2,000 feet, and finally came to a poorly built bridge over a stream. A group of a dozen or so kukus met us. This group promptly embraced us all, jubilantly joined us, and practically assaulted us with a genital approach. Suggestions of fellatio were done in the most hospitable, friendly, ribald, and exuberant fashion, and on the high tide of kuku enthusiasm, we were carried into the stockaded village. I am most curious to know what role homosexuality plays in their culture.
And Carleton obviously got a lot of pleasure out of describing all this and being part of all that, because it was an interesting part of their culture, which is quite different from the foray.
Carleton was well aware that what he was doing with respect to Kuru was his ticket to stay, because that's what the outside world thought was exciting and important. All the while, his major interest was cultural anthropology. I think had he chosen to concentrate on this, you'd find that he'd become a Nobel laureate in that field. But he chose not to.
As usual, Gajdusek documented all he could on film and taped his comments.
On the day following our arrival, the youths who had been married were assembled. The youths, having been brought up until this period in a pattern of marked and restricted homosexuality, are now required quickly to change to the role of married men. Should anyone fondle, touch, embrace, or caress their new wives, they were immediately to kill him. The youths, accustomed to give in politely to rivals in attempts at seduction in their homosexual community, are now admonished to permit no rivals. Here the husbands are being brought into the presence of their wives for the first time. They are both ashamed and embarrassed and keep their backs turned to their wives. I myself am shown here. One of the boys took the camera and made the picture of me with house kappa or wayajeka.
Carleton writes in his diary about how he loved the smell of the kuka male adolescents, the smell of grease, pig fat, wood fires and semen. Now, whether he actively participated in any of these practices is another matter. Or did he just fantasize about his participation? But they clearly fascinated him.
Gajdusek's fascination had deep roots. For years he had recorded in his journal his anguish over his attraction to young boys.
Well, see, the thing is this, is that I think Carleton's sexual interest in people is highly sublimated. And the thing is, I had a sensitivity to this subject because I had been sexually abused by a neighbor when I was a kid. So I had antennas out for anybody who might be approaching me. It was an area that I was very sensitive to, and never had that feeling with Carleton. Never felt any danger or I don't think Carleton would coerce anybody to do anything. I don't think that's his nature.
Quite honestly, you know, I didn't even know Carleton was gay. In fact, I would have thought of Carleton as asexual, sort of like Michelangelo up in the Sistine Chapel working with paint in his face, thinking of nothing but work.
But I asked myself, who is Carleton? And I said, he's my foster brother. I don't know Carleton is a pedophile. Can't prove it by me, okay? But there are people in this world who will try to hurt you. And I think he came across one of those. What he did for me just can't be described. I think he gave me, the ability to find myself and cultivate myself to be who I am today. But I don't think he ever thought about it that way.
My feeling is there was a lot of celibacy in Carleton's life. Years and years of celibacy. And I have reason to think I'm correct about that.
Gajdusek writes, "The society in which I live denies me the right to exercise my love, even if in sublimated form, if I'm honest enough to admit the force behind the sublimation." It seems that Gajdusek found life in New Guinea and the South Seas a relief. Here he found a place where his love wouldn't need to be sublimated and where he wouldn't be judged by Western values.
Clearly, as Carleton himself admits, there's a libidinal element which drives his desire to be affiliated with these people, the foray people, the kuka people, people all over the world that he regards as primitives, and that's part of his collection of specimens, of brains, of blood, of boys. There's no doubt about that. But a libidinal element shouldn't be reduced to sexual molestation.
But sexual molestation was exactly what Gajdusek was being accused of back home in the US.
All of the allegations in this case involved the lesser degrees of child abuse. So we were looking at misdemeanors, which is really just an improper touching. And misdemeanors have to be charged within a year and a day after they occur. So legally they were unable to do anything about that.
Before the discovery in 1996, the FBI had been investigating Gajdusek closely for years. Dozens of foster kids had been interviewed, but all denied that anything inappropriate had happened.
Well, it is often the case that victims are reluctant to come forward. I think there were some people, frankly, that believed that this was a small price to pay for what they got in return. They were brought to the U.S., brought out of a terrible situation. They were educated, they were fed, they were housed, they were clothed. So why would they come forward and complain? Some of them, it had happened so long ago that they didn't want to rehash it. They had recovered from it, put it behind them. So I think that was a reluctance. And then there were people that were simply reluctant to admit that they had engaged in a man-man or a man-boy relationship with somebody. They knew what was at stake, and their reputations could be harmed because of this. So it was very, very heavy at first.
The evidence that the FBI had developed was extremely slim. However, the subject of child sexual abuse is so inflammatory in the United States. It was an absolute combat between the prosecuting agencies, the investigative agencies, and Carleton's lawyers. And it was a knockdown, drag-out fight. There was all kinds of lying and misrepresentation, at least on the part of the prosecuting agencies.
It seems Gajdusek's colleagues still couldn't face up to the possibility that he harmed any of his foster children. But the FBI now had clear evidence, a recorded telephone conversation where Gajdusek had admitted to having had sex with a foster son who was then 16 years old.
There was an element of entrapment, I think. I saw the transcript of the first conversation. I think the prime mover here is his accuser. I don't know what motivated him. It was something that people did in the islands, a little mutual masturbation, maybe kissing of the penis, but no penetration, mouth or anus like that, but just more a kind of the way you might tickle a child in America, not taboo, no distress for the child. And Carleton was doing something that was natural in another place in this country. That was his mistake.
Well, to this day, I honestly don't know the real story. All I know is what I read. It's the age of a young man that he was involved with, but that was consensual. You know, my mind, it's not the most horrible sin in the world if it's consensual, but I wish he chose his age a little bit later. Now, if this were a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, I'd be in trouble with Carleton and think he really needs help, you know?
It's not an area where I would be quick either to condemn or to condone. I think it's very, very complex. There are many, many considerations to do with power, with different cultures, which are really outside my understanding, and I have to say outside my interests.
You know, quite frankly, I actually think that attention to his family, his sons, and what may or may not have happened there, maybe especially the accusations of sexual molestation, are rather banal. I don't think they're nearly as interesting anyhow as the science.
Carleton's engagement with his kids, in my view, was all good. And if taking a kid to bed and giving him a big hug and sleeping with him, literally, is having sex, well, then he had sex with them. But he's certainly not had sex in which he's penetrating these kids and abusing them against their will and so forth. I mean, he was doing the sort of thing that parents do all the time.
You know, you have to understand, the pedophiles, most of them have a methodology that they use that we call grooming. They find the right child. It's usually a child who's either having problems at home or is isolated from the parents. Then they start by getting close to them and telling them what they want to hear and praising them with excessive hugs and holding on a little longer. And the child may respond to that because a lot of these kids need love and they want love and they're getting it. And then it slowly progresses, and the next thing they know, this adult is doing something to them that's confusing to them, but frankly, from a physiological standpoint, may feel pleasant, and before they know it, they're a victim. And I don't see anything different in this case of it happening, other than almost in a textbook way.
You know, there's no other term except to say that he's a paedophile. And I mean, that's what Carleton was saying. Yes, of course I'm a paedophile. Jesus Christ was a paedophile. I mean, everyone. I love kids, you know, and which is true. But it, you know, that term now has such bad connotations.
Has he hurt children or has he not? I mean, maybe that's one of the central questions.
Well, that's precisely the central question which I prefer not to face. The argument is that the children have been from these islands where this thing is not an exceptional behavior. Therefore, it's a close issue. So I prefer to leave it at that.
I have particularly refused to educate myself about other people's sex lives. But some of the things that Carleton and I have talked about had to do with doing harm to anyone. And I really don't believe that Carleton has been a violent or harmful person, especially where children are concerned. But I think the legal situation forced him into a position that he ended up pleading guilty. And I think that was a very bad and violent and horrible thing that was done to him.
I would have guessed early on in this case that there was no way this case would have worked out with a plea agreement. I mean, I just didn't think that he would plead guilty to anything.
The idea of going to trial became absolutely repellent, impossible. Any sane adult person, and Carleton is a sane adult person, would look at this and say, the people who are asking me to do this would never understand anyway. They never understand anything important about my life. It's beneath me. There's a kind of a pride that I think comes into play in a situation like this. And so his lawyers began to turn to negotiating a deal. But of course, in the United States, Carleton's reputation is ruined forever.
I think sometimes people believe that they're above the law, and I don't know whether they think it's because of their accomplishments or it's because of their prestige or because they have a lot of money. And it was important to me to say it's all the same, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're a Nobel Prize winner, or whether you're a sanitation engineer. If you abuse children and have sex with minors, then you go to jail.
Gajdusek was sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment for illegal sexual relations.
I wrote my letter in his support that I had never perceived him that way. We wrote what we saw of him, but the truth may be in himself. So the truth may not be with me. But I'm almost like his grandson. I miss him.
And what I say to myself is, did the right thing. I think every child is that way. They should take an action. But I still love Carleton. He's my father. He brought me up as a child, but he's a good man. I still think of him and wish that I could see him again.
I can't speak for him, but my personal feeling is that he absolutely, unequivocally does not think that he has done anything wrong at all. But I do think that he feels that this was a loving thing that he was doing. He wasn't harming anybody, that the people involved were willing participants, and that justifies it. I think he believes that he was wronged and that we are the ones with the problem, not him.
Gajdusek and his admirers argued that if sex with children was okay in their native culture, he wasn't wrong to join in. Yet, even if that might be true, they miss the obvious. Transplanting this to the US is a different story. Moreover, I discovered that for Carleton, the sex was never restricted to kids from the South Seas.
My first experience with him in a sexual way was when he approached me when I was a young child, about 7 or 8 years old, in my bed in Salem where I lived growing up. And he would come to me in the middle of the night and fondle me and talk to me and try to impress upon me his views of the world and his travels, and all in a way to impress me and to awe me with his importance. He would compliment me and compliment my body, and then gradually ease his way into touching me, either by telling me about my parts of my body and how they operated from a scientific standpoint. And then he would, pull my pants down, my pajama bottoms, and would then touch me on my genitals. And then, maybe pull them back up and then talk to me a little bit more. And he kissed me on my genitals again, so that it was almost as if there was nothing unnatural about it whatsoever. But it was repeated over a number of years where he would come to me and sexually abuse me.
I have never once taken a kid to my bed. They have come to my bed, and I am no one to kick them out. If they hug me and I find them playing with my cock, I say, good on you, I play with theirs. And I'll do it now and with great pleasure.
When you grow up with a culture that does not condone this, that totally objects to it,
no culture condones it.
Surely it must hurt you when you get subjected to a grown-up forcing sexuality on you.
Boy, what a brainwashed person you are. With 300 or 400 boys who had sex with me from 8 and 10 and 12, 100% have run into my bed, jumped in without my mentioning it, and asked for sex. I have never asked for it. I've never, and most of my friends, don't you realize that I was jumping in people's beds hoping they would take me? All boys want a lover. My God.
You as a kid.
And the idea that these men go after you don't have any point in the world. Now, come on. That's the rule of the game.
The question of whether to say no never occurred to me. It never occurred to me. I knew this person to be my father's friend, my father's mentor, someone my father admired extremely. I had no idea what was happening to me. And when I grew older, and this is what I think was part of Carleton's plan in trying to groom me to be someone who he could then do more with sexually, was to try to get me to like it. So that's what he did. He got me to like it. And by getting me to like it, he could then do more. And then with, I presume, some sort of assurance that I wouldn't talk to anybody and wouldn't say no. But was I given the tools to be able to make a decision for myself? No, I wasn't. And I was never encouraged to do so. And so, naturally I would have some anger about that, I think. Naturally I would have a great deal of resentment and anger towards Carleton because I think he's frankly a criminal. And the idea that somehow he is a benevolent figure to children is unfathomable to me. I can't imagine ever doing that.
I find it hard to believe that an observing eye like Carleton Gajdusek's could be blind to the damage he might do to kids by having sex with them. How could a mind, so brilliant in so many ways, convince itself that children's need of adult contact and love is a desire for sex with adults? How were you as a kid?
The same way. The first time, I've told everybody, it's in my journal 10 times. My uncle took me, I was exactly 6, I know exactly, it was a few days before my 7th birthday, for a few weeks, in Slovakia, my father's birth house.
And that was when we went back to my father's village in Smrdaki, and there we met the family and everything. And we were left there while my mother and father went off to Budapest and elsewhere, enjoying themselves. We used to take baths in the backyard, naked, in troughs that had hollowed out like Indian canoes out of trees and whatever. And I'm sure that when he was in the bath there, as well as in the baths at the Castillo, I'm sure he probably suffered an erection in the presence of Uncle Crystal or something, and it may have been one of his first sexual reactions. But I'm sure that must have happened.
Oh, we take baths together in the clubs and all, and I'm immediately, for the first time, having an erect cock near me and all that. Boy, what fun I had. I played with him and everything else. 100% I seduced him. He was just having a bath with me and got a little erection. I didn't let him go, please. I have such a crush on him that the 17-year-old girl tells me, stop making Crystal embarrassed. He was the first goddamn person on earth I met who didn't stand in awe and want to display me and record me because of my goddamn intellect. He loved my body, and I loved that. He was the first one who gave me pride. He's the greatest man in my life. If any of 50 other people who once had played with me, boy, how much happier I would have been at 10, 11, 12. I dreamt about it, hoped about it, and they wouldn't do it.
Wanting to be loved as a child rather than a genius. Sex with adults instead of being loved by adults. Sex with boys instead of loving boys. It is a dangerous circle Gajdusek defends.
I don't know why. The why I don't know. It's rather foolish when you ask me those questions. You're not bright enough to answer it, and certainly I'm not. And so therefore I don't have any respect for your hypothesis. I wouldn't believe Freud's, and I have none. So the answer is you're not going to get why out of me most of the time. I speak in fractals. I prefer to analyze nature. But to ask why implies a wisdom you don't have and I don't have. God doesn't have it as far as I'm concerned.
Gajdusek tries to defend pedophilia with the same hard-headed energy and self-confidence that gave him success in scientific research. His unique personality, his ability to analyze the world more creatively than others, enabled him to break the boundaries of scientific study, leading to some revolutionary discoveries. But those same abilities allowed him to convince himself he wasn't causing pain, blinding himself to the emotional consequences for him and for those he holds dear.
Carleton to me was very close to being a saint. In a strange way, I never questioned anything he did. Anything he did seemed to me to be justified by the doing, by the whatever was behind it. And then in these last few years, I've realized that no, I questioned in him lack of remorse for things he has done. I questioned in him interpretation of events in ways that are, I think, self-serving. And he is insufficiently sensitive to the effect that he has on others. And that all leads me to the feeling that Carleton says, I've only brought love, and I say, no, Carleton, you brought release, passion, and the sense of love to a great many people who are unprepared from it at a moment when they were terribly vulnerable and their lives have been hurt by it. They have not been amended by it.
And shame is one thing, but what shame does to you is another. The fact that I didn't stand up in '96 when he was arrested and I didn't say anything is actually a damning thing for me. That I didn't stand up and be a voice to help that poor boy who was also in that situation. I should have helped him. And I think a lot of people think, I remember my father sort of ranting and raving about how Carleton was entrapped and that this wasn't fair and this was all wrong and that the law enforcement agencies were out to get him, and it was all hysteria, in my view, because it was only a matter of time before this happened. It was only a matter of time.
In fact, I feel like a fool acting for your camera and your thing. I feel despicable and unclean. I never in my life intended to ever do such a fool thing as acting in my own biography. I think it's despicable and unclean. I would ridicule any human who is so dumb to take a role in his biography, to act his own role for his famous person. I've never seen anything more despicable. It's like betrayal. Like Judas was an angel compared to it. So what you're asking me to do is much more despicable than fucking. There is what I consider a normal family. He pushes and pushes to help mother please. And when that happens, you have endearing families for life. If you want tender care from your children, if you want them to wipe your ass when you're 90 and you're demented, if you want them to stick around when you're sick, instead of putting you in an old age, almost everybody here does and never visits them. If you want the family to stick together, you have to have intergenerational sex. intergenerational. And it has to be within
this
the
is
family.
where we don't think the same, Carleton. I mean, I don't believe this.
Well, I think it's that. I think the whole problem of the whole world is the lack of it. And I consider it a defective upbringing if you haven't had helped your parents have fun in sex.
Gajdusek would continue to bring up the subjects of pedophilia and sex until the completion of this film, as if obsessed by the need to convince the world, and perhaps himself.
Oh God, I don't want to betray him, but I think this is partly bragging. You know, his life has been much reduced, and there's a certain amount of wishful thinking or bragging there.
Oh, fear for him and saying, you silly guy, you make matters worse and worse, and what else can you feel? And you can't tell him that. You're going to tell Carleton Gajdusek to shut up. Yeah, sure, sure.
I don't know. I think that he views it as being very much part of his personality. I don't think so. That is, I admire him very well without it, and I don't think it's an inevitable part of it. But he knows better about it, I imagine.
If you or someone you know has been affected by the issues covered in this programme and would like further sources of information or support, you can call the BBC Action Line in confidence on 08000 680 133. Calls are free from a landline. Mobile operators will charge for these calls. Lines are open 24 hours a day.